The sun rose over the Judean hills on a day in 701 BCE that would mark the beginning of one of the most thoroughly documented military operations in ancient history. From his camp north of the city, King Sennacherib of Assyria surveyed the fortress of Lachish, second only to Jerusalem in the Kingdom of Judah. The city sat atop a commanding hill rising 40 metres above the surrounding Shephelah Valley, its double walls and massive gate complex representing the finest military architecture of the Iron Age. What happened over the following weeks would be immortalised in stone reliefs, recorded in royal inscriptions, chronicled in sacred texts, and preserved in archaeological evidence so detailed that modern scholars can reconstruct the battle with unprecedented precision. This is the story of how the most sophisticated war machine of the ancient world destroyed a city that refused to yield, and how terror became a weapon more powerful than bronze or iron. The Assyrian Empire of the 8th century BCE represented a revolution in organised violence. For over 2 centuries, the Assyrians had been perfecting the art of conquest, transforming warfare from seasonal raids by farmer soldiers into a year-round profession conducted by the first true standing army in history. By the time Sennacherib ascended to the throne in 705 BCE, Assyria controlled the largest land empire the world had yet seen, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the mountains of Anatolia to the borders of Egypt. This vast domain was held together not by loyalty or shared culture, but by the systematic application of overwhelming military force and calculated terror. The Assyrian army numbered between 150,000 and 200,000 men at its peak, a force larger than anything that would be seen again until the Persian Empire 2 centuries later. But size alone did not make the Assyrian military machine unstoppable. What set them apart was their integration of multiple weapon systems, their mastery of siege warfare, and most importantly their complete willingness to employ whatever methods necessary to ensure submission. The foundation of Assyrian military superiority lay in their early adoption and mass production of iron weapons. While neighbouring kingdoms still relied heavily on bronze, the Assyrians had mastered iron metallurgy by the 9th century BCE, giving their soldiers weapons that were stronger, less brittle, and more reliable than anything their enemies could field. An Assyrian soldier carried an iron-tipped spear roughly 5 feet long, wore armour plated with iron scales, and sheltered behind shields reinforced with iron bands. This technological advantage was multiplied by professional training that transformed conscripts into specialised warriors. The Assyrian army was organised into distinct units, each trained for specific roles. Heavy infantry formed the core, armoured spearmen who could hold a line against any assault. Archers, both on foot and mounted, provided devastating range firepower, their composite bows capable of punching arrows through armour at 200 yards. Light infantry armed with slings hurled stones and lead shot with lethal accuracy. Cavalry units, a relatively new innovation that the Assyrians had pioneered, provided speed and mobility that traditional chariots could not match. But perhaps most important were the engineers, the first permanent corps of military engineers in history, whose expertise in siege warfare made fortified cities vulnerable for the first time. Sennacherib had inherited not just an empire but a crisis. In 705 BCE, his father Sargon II had died in battle against mountain tribesmen, a shocking defeat that encouraged rebellion across the empire. In Babylon, the empire's second city, rebels had installed their own king and were openly defying Assyrian authority. In the west, the small kingdoms of the Levant saw an opportunity. King Hezekiah of Judah, emboldened by promises of Egyptian support, withheld tribute, fortified his cities, and rallied other small states to join in resistance. For 3 years, Sennacherib was occupied with the Babylonian revolt, which he crushed with characteristic brutality, literally flooding the rebellious city with diverted river water until its magnificent buildings disappeared beneath the currents. Then, in 701 BCE, he turned his attention westward to deal with the upstart kingdoms of the Levant. The campaign began in Phoenicia, where the cities of Sidon and Tyre quickly submitted rather than face destruction. Moving south along the coastal plain, Sennacherib's army swept through Philistia, capturing the cities of Joppa, Beth Dagon, and Bene-Berak. The king of Ashkelon, who had joined Hezekiah's rebellion, was captured and deported. At Eltekeh, Sennacherib met and defeated an Egyptian army that had marched north to support the rebels, shattering any hope of outside assistance for Judah. Now the full weight of the Assyrian war machine turned toward the kingdom of Judah. The campaign that followed would be remembered as one of the most devastating in the ancient Near East. Sennacherib's own inscriptions boast of capturing 46 fortified cities and countless smaller towns, carrying away 200,000 prisoners. Modern scholars believe this number is exaggerated for propaganda purposes, but archaeological evidence confirms the systematic destruction of Judean settlements during this period. Lachish represented the key to Judah's defence. The city controlled the main route from the coastal plain to the hill country, blocking the most practical approach to Jerusalem. Built on a prominent hill with steep slopes on three sides, fortified with a double line of massive walls, defended by one of the most sophisticated gate complexes in the ancient world, Lachish was considered nearly impregnable. The main city wall, constructed of mud brick on stone foundations, was 6 meters thick and rose perhaps 10 meters above the mound. Halfway down the slope, a revetment wall added another layer of defence. The southwestern gate, the main entrance to the city, consisted of an outer gatehouse built of massive stones protruding from the city wall, connected by a passage to an inner gatehouse with 3 pairs of chambers, each fitted with wooden doors on bronze hinges. Towers studded the walls at regular intervals, providing overlapping fields of fire for defenders. The garrison numbered perhaps 1,500 men, including local militia, professional soldiers, and mercenaries. They were equipped with the best weapons Judah could provide: iron-tipped spears, composite bows, slings, and large shields. Hundreds of arrowheads, slingstones, and other military equipment had been stockpiled for the coming siege. The palace fort that dominated the centre of the city was the largest Iron Age structure yet discovered in the region, covering nearly half an acre. From its walls, defenders could see the Hebron Hills to the east and the coastal plain to the west. It served as the residence of the governor, a military headquarters, and a last redoubt if the outer walls were breached. Storerooms filled with grain, oil, and wine could sustain the garrison and civilian population for months. Royal storage jars bearing the seal LMLK, belonging to the king, had been collected from across Judah to provision the city's defence. Everything suggested that Lachish intended to resist, confident that its fortifications and supplies would allow it to hold out until the Assyrians gave up or were recalled to deal with trouble elsewhere in the empire. When the Assyrian army arrived at Lachish, they brought with them the accumulated expertise of generations of siege warfare. The force that surrounded the city probably numbered around 30,000 men, a typical Assyrian field army consisting of various mixes of infantry, cavalry, and chariots. When arrayed for battle, such a force had a frontage of 2,500 yards and a depth of 100 yards, a living wall of armed men that enclosed the city in an iron grip. The first phase of any Assyrian siege followed a well-established pattern. Envoys would ride up to the walls and demand surrender, offering reasonable terms if the city submitted immediately. The people would be treated well, their property respected, their leaders allowed to remain in authority as Assyrian vassals. Resistance, however, meant total destruction. The Assyrians cultivated their reputation for ruthlessness deliberately. Cities that resisted faced not just defeat but annihilation. Survivors could expect torture, impalement, flaying, deportation to distant corners of the empire. This was not random cruelty but calculated policy. Psychological warfare designed to make resistance seem futile. The defenders of Lachish rejected the surrender demand. Perhaps they believed their fortifications were too strong. Perhaps they trusted that Egyptian forces would arrive to relieve them. Perhaps they felt they had no choice but to fight, knowing that Assyrian victory would mean the end of their independence regardless. Whatever their reasoning, the decision to resist sealed the city's fate. The Assyrian response was methodical and overwhelming. The army completely surrounded the city, cutting off all communication with the outside world. Supply lines were severed. Anyone attempting to escape was captured or killed. Archers and slingers moved within range of the walls and began a systematic bombardment, keeping defenders away from the parapets, while engineers conducted their work. The evidence of this bombardment is still visible in the archaeological record. Hundreds of iron arrowheads, primarily of Assyrian type, were found in the destruction layer. These were not the simple bronze or stone points used by earlier armies, but sophisticated three-bladed iron heads designed to penetrate armour and cause devastating wounds. Assyrian archers were among the best in the ancient world, capable of rapid, accurate fire at ranges up to 200 yards. They worked in pairs, one archer shooting while a shield-bearer protected him with a massive wicker shield tall enough to cover both men. The defenders fired back with everything they had. Judean arrowheads, distinguishable by their different design, were found mixed with the Assyrian examples. Defenders hurled stones from the towers, some weighing several pounds, capable of crushing a man's skull through his helmet. Pots of flaming pitch were dropped on attackers who came too close, creating walls of fire at the base of the fortifications. But the rain of projectiles from the Assyrians was relentless, thousands of arrows and stones keeping the battlements clear while the real work of the siege proceeded. The Assyrians had recognized that the southern approach to Lachish offered the best opportunity for assault. The northern side of the hill was too steep for effective attack, but to the southwest, a saddle of relatively level ground connected the main tell to a smaller hillock. This was where the Assyrians would build their siege ramp, and where the fate of Lachish would be decided. The construction of a siege ramp represented one of the most impressive feats of ancient military engineering. Modern calculations suggest that the Lachish ramp required roughly 20,000 tons of stone and earth, built to a length of approximately 260 feet, rising from the saddle to the top of the city wall. Even working around the clock, it would have taken the Assyrian army between 20 and 25 days to construct. The ramp was built using a specific technique that minimized the defenders' advantage. Rather than constructing from the ground up, which would have left the builders exposed to fire from above, the Assyrians built from the back forward. Stones and earth were brought up the completed portion of the ramp and dumped over the forward edge, creating a constantly advancing causeway. This method, clearly understood by biblical authors who use the Hebrew verb meaning to pour when describing ramp construction, meant that the height advantage of the defenders was progressively reduced as the ramp advanced. The upper surface was carefully smoothed and topped with wooden planks, creating a roadway capable of supporting the massive siege towers that would deliver the final assault. While the ramp was under construction, the defenders were not passive. Archaeological evidence suggests they built a counter-ramp on the inside of the city wall, directly opposite the Assyrian ramp, attempting to maintain their height advantage as the attackers climbed higher. They reinforced the threatened section of wall, adding extra layers of brick and stone. They dug tunnels, attempting to undermine the advancing ramp or set fires beneath it. But every defensive measure was met with an Assyrian countermeasure. Tunnels were discovered and collapsed. Counterattacks were driven back by concentrated archery fire. The defenders were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that had perfected these techniques over generations of conquest. The siege towers that the Assyrians brought up the completed ramp represented the cutting edge of ancient military technology. These were not simple wooden platforms but sophisticated machines, mobile fortresses on wheels that could be pushed directly against enemy walls. The Lachish reliefs that Sennacherib later commissioned provide detailed depictions of these towers in action. They were multi-story structures, protected by hides or metal plating to resist fire and missiles, with wheels that could be locked or unlocked as needed. The most fearsome feature was the battering ram, a massive iron-headed beam suspended by chains from the tower's interior. This was not just a log, but a precisely engineered weapon, the metal head designed to concentrate maximum force on a minimum area, the chains allowing the ram to swing with devastating impact. A single tower required a crew of perhaps 20 men to operate, some to push and maneuver the tower into position, others to work the ram, still others to provide covering fire from upper platforms. The impact when these rams struck was tremendous, capable of breaching even the thickest walls given enough time. As the siege towers rolled up the ramp toward the walls of Lachish, the battle entered its final, most desperate phase. Defenders crowded the threatened section of wall, hurling everything they had at the approaching machines. Stones, arrows, flaming torches rained down on the towers. Some defenders grabbed the heads of the rams with hooked poles, trying to deflect or entangle them. Others poured oil down the walls and set it alight, attempting to burn the towers. But the Assyrians had prepared for all of this. The towers were covered with wet hides to resist flame. Crews of men used ladles to scoop water from containers and douse any fires that started. Archers on the tower platform shot down any defender who exposed himself. Slowly, inexorably, the rams smashed into the wall. The sound of the rams must have been terrifying. Each blow sent shockwaves through the fortifications, shaking the foundations, cracking the mud brick. Hour after hour the pounding continued, each impact weakening the wall a little more. The defenders knew that once a breach was created, the end would come quickly. Assyrian infantry would pour through the gap, their superior numbers and professional training overwhelming the exhausted garrison. Those who survived the initial assault could expect no mercy. The reliefs that Sennacherib commissioned show what happened when the walls finally gave way. Defenders are shown being thrown from the ramparts, their bodies tumbling down the slopes. Others are depicted impaled on stakes, standard Assyrian practice for those who resisted. Some are shown being led away in chains, beginning the long march to exile in distant Assyria. Women and children, loaded with their possessions, stream out of the city gates under Assyrian guard. The city burns, flames rising from buildings throughout the tell. The archaeological evidence confirms these depictions with gruesome detail. The destruction layer at Lachish from 701 BCE shows a city consumed by catastrophic fire. In some areas, the accumulation of burned debris reaches nearly 2 meters in depth. Sun-dried bricks that fell from the upper portions of walls were baked hard by the intense heat. Pottery vessels were found crushed and distorted by the temperatures. The inner city gate, the palace fort, and all private houses were burned and razed to the ground. The conflagration was so intense that it left a 3-foot layer of charred debris across much of the site. This was not the result of accidental fire, but of deliberate systematic destruction. The Assyrians burned Lachish as a message to every other city in Judah: this is what happens to those who resist. Near the site, archaeologists discovered a mass grave containing approximately 1,500 skulls, roughly the entire adult male population of the city. These were not soldiers killed in battle, but captives executed after the city fell, men who had surrendered expecting at least to live as prisoners or slaves. Instead, they were methodically slaughtered and dumped in caves near the city. This was Assyrian policy carried out to the letter. Resistance meant not just defeat, but extermination. The survivors, primarily women, children, and younger men suitable for slavery, were deported. Sennacherib's inscriptions claim 200,000 prisoners taken from Judah overall, and while this number is likely inflated, the scale of deportation was enormous by any measure. These prisoners would be resettled throughout the empire, their labour used to build new cities and monuments, their presence in foreign lands, helping to dilute local populations and prevent future rebellions. The siege had cost the Assyrians heavily as well. The mass grave near Lachish contained roughly 1,500 Assyrian dead, suggesting that the city's defenders had fought with desperate courage before the end. This casualty rate, perhaps 5% of the besieging force, was unusually high, and indicates that the defenders had made the Assyrians pay dearly for their victory. But for Sennacherib, the cost was acceptable. The fall of Lachish broke the back of Judean resistance. With their second city destroyed and their army shattered, Hezekiah and the remaining defenders of Jerusalem found themselves in an impossible position. The importance Sennacherib placed on his victory at Lachish is revealed by what he did next. When he returned to his capital at Nineveh, he commissioned an entire room in his palace to commemorate the siege. The southwest palace, which Sennacherib called his palace without rival, was the largest and most magnificent building in Assyria. Within it, room 36 was dedicated entirely to the siege of Lachish. The walls were covered with stone relief panels spanning approximately 80 feet, depicting every phase of the battle in remarkable detail. The Lachish reliefs, as they came to be known, represent one of the most important historical documents from the ancient world. They show the topography of the battlefield, the architecture of the city, the equipment and tactics of both sides, with an attention to detail that suggests they were based on sketches made during the actual siege. Assyrian soldiers are shown climbing the ramp under covering fire from archers. Siege towers advance toward the walls, their rams pounding the fortifications. Defenders crowd the battlements, hurling stones and shooting arrows at the attackers. The double wall system is clearly depicted, as are the projecting towers and the gate complex. One panel shows Sennacherib himself, seated on an elaborate throne before the captured city. An inscription above him reads, "Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of the country of Assyria, sitting on the throne of judgment before the city of Lachish. I give permission for its slaughter." This is the only battle scene Sennacherib chose to commemorate in such detail, suggesting that he considered the capture of Lachish his greatest military achievement. The reliefs were not just art but propaganda. a visual demonstration of Assyrian power meant to impress visitors and intimidate potential rebels. Nobles, ambassadors, tributary kings would have walked through this room, seeing the fate of those who defied Assyria depicted in stone. The message was clear and unmistakable. Resistance is futile. Submission is the only rational choice. The reliefs also provide invaluable details about ancient warfare that would otherwise be lost. We can see the design of Assyrian armour, the construction of their shields, the configuration of their siege engines. We can observe how infantry formations worked, how cavalry supported ground operations, how engineers protected themselves while building siege ramps. The clothing of Judean defenders, their weapons, even their facial features are depicted with careful attention to accuracy. Architectural details of Lachish, the sloped roofs of houses, the construction of the walls, the layout of the gate complex all correspond remarkably well with archaeological findings at the site. After the fall of Lachish, Sennacherib moved against Jerusalem. He did not besiege the city in the same way he had Lachish. Jerusalem's fortifications were even more formidable. Its position atop a steep-sided ridge made it difficult to approach, and the Assyrian army had already been reduced by casualties and the need to garrison captured territories. Instead, Sennacherib established a blockade, cutting off supplies and waiting for starvation to do his work. He sent his officers to the walls of Jerusalem to deliver carefully calculated psychological warfare. Speaking in Hebrew so the defenders could understand, the Assyrian envoys pointed out that no city had withstood Assyrian assault, that their god Yahweh was no more powerful than the gods of all the other nations Assyria had conquered, that Hezekiah had led them to disaster, and that surrender was their only hope of survival. The biblical accounts in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah describe what happened next. Hezekiah, faced with imminent disaster, agreed to pay an enormous tribute to buy off the Assyrian threat. The Bible records that he stripped the temple in Jerusalem of its gold and silver, even cutting the gold plating from doors and doorposts to raise the demanded sum. Sennacherib's own annals confirm receiving tribute from Hezekiah, listing 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, along with precious stones, ivory furniture, and Hezekiah's own daughters and palace women as hostages. The biblical and Assyrian accounts differ on some details, with the Assyrian version claiming larger amounts of tribute, but they agree on the essential fact that Hezekiah bought his survival with everything of value he possessed. Mysteriously, the Assyrian army then withdrew without sacking Jerusalem. The biblical account attributes this to divine intervention, reporting that an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, forcing Sennacherib to retreat. Modern scholars have proposed various naturalistic explanations. Perhaps plague broke out in the Assyrian camp, a constant danger for ancient armies operating in unfamiliar territory. Perhaps news arrived of trouble elsewhere in the empire requiring Sennacherib's immediate attention. Perhaps the tribute Hezekiah paid was sufficient to satisfy Assyrian demands without the cost and risk of assaulting Jerusalem's formidable defences. Whatever the reason, Jerusalem survived when Lachish had fallen, a fact that had enormous theological significance for the people of Judah. The contrast between the fates of Lachish and Jerusalem shaped Jewish understanding of their relationship with God for centuries afterward. Lachish had been destroyed despite its strong walls and brave defenders, proof that human strength alone could not save them. Jerusalem had survived despite being in an apparently hopeless situation, which was interpreted as evidence of divine protection. The prophets Isaiah and Micah both referenced these events, using them to argue that trust in God rather than military might was what would preserve the nation. The fall of Lachish became a cautionary tale about the limits of human power, while the survival of Jerusalem reinforced faith in divine intervention. The archaeological record of Lachish, after 701 BCE, tells a story of devastation from which the city never fully recovered. Following the destruction, the site appears to have been largely abandoned for a time. When resettlement began, it was on a much smaller scale than before. The magnificent palace fort was not rebuilt. The double wall system was not restored to its former glory. Lachish in the 7th century BCE was a shadow of its former self, a small town rather than a mighty fortress. This decline was typical of Judean cities that resisted Assyria. The kingdom that emerged from Sennacherib's campaign was diminished, impoverished, reduced to vassal status, its independence a memory. The Lachish letters, a collection of ostraca inscribed in ancient Hebrew found during excavations in the 1930s, provide a poignant epilogue to the city's story. Written during the final days of the Kingdom of Judah in 568 or 586 BCE, when a Babylonian army was systematically conquering the remaining fortified cities, these letters were communications between military commanders desperately trying to coordinate defence. One letter mentions that the fires of Azekah, a nearby fortress, were no longer visible, suggesting it had fallen. Another states that the garrison was watching for fire signals from Jerusalem. The letters convey a sense of isolation, desperation, and impending doom. Within months, the Babylonians would capture and destroy Lachish a second time, completing what the Assyrians had begun. The city would eventually be abandoned altogether, left in ruins for future archaeologists to discover. The discovery of the Lachish reliefs in the mid-19th century caused a sensation in European scholarly circles. In 1845, Austin Henry Layard, a young English adventurer who had abandoned a promising legal career for archaeology, began excavating in northern Iraq near the modern city of Mosul. He was searching for evidence of the ancient civilizations mentioned in the Bible. What he found exceeded his wildest expectations. Beneath a mound of earth lay the ruins of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, its palaces filled with perfectly preserved stone reliefs depicting scenes from thousands of years earlier. Among these was the room dedicated to the siege of Lachish. The reliefs were carefully removed and shipped to London, where they became one of the prize exhibits of the British Museum. For the first time, Europeans could see the ancient world not through texts and fragmentary artifacts, but through detailed visual documentation created by eyewitnesses to the events they depicted. The reliefs caused particular excitement because they provided independent confirmation of biblical accounts. Here was evidence that the events described in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles were not myths or legends, but historical facts, recorded by the Assyrians themselves. The correspondence between the reliefs and the biblical text, down to details like the location of Sennacherib's camp at Lachish during the siege, suggested that the Bible preserved accurate historical memories of these events. This was particularly important in an era when many scholars questioned the historical reliability of biblical texts. The Lachish reliefs could not be dismissed as pious fiction. They were Assyrian propaganda created to glorify Sennacherib's victory, and they confirmed that the Assyrian campaign against Judah described in the Bible had indeed occurred. Modern excavations at Tel Lachish, beginning in the 1930s and continuing intermittently to the present day, have added layer upon layer of detail to our understanding of the siege. British archaeologist James Starkey led the first major excavation from 1932 until his murder by Arab militants in 1938. His team uncovered massive destruction layers, fortification systems, and thousands of artifacts dating to the Assyrian period. Israeli archaeologist David Osishkin conducted extensive excavations from 1973 to 1994, systematically exploring the site and publishing findings that set new standards for archaeological documentation. His work precisely identified the location of the Assyrian siege ramp, still visible today as a massive slope of stones on the southwest side of the Tell. Recent excavations led by international teams continue to reveal new information about life in ancient Lachish and the details of its destruction. The siege ramp at Lachish is the only surviving example of an Assyrian siege work, making it an invaluable source of information about ancient military engineering. The ramp is roughly 70 meters wide at its base, 25 meters wide at the top, and rises approximately 16 meters to reach the level of the city wall. It consists of tons of stones, many quarried from the bedrock, carefully placed to create a stable incline that could support the massive siege towers. The presence of the ramp, combined with the evidence from the reliefs and the archaeological destruction layer, allows historians to reconstruct the siege with confidence. We know where the Assyrians attacked. We know how they built their approach ramp. We know what weapons they used. We know how the defenders responded. Few ancient battles can be documented with such precision. The importance of the Lachish siege extends beyond the immediate historical event. It represents a case study in ancient warfare, demonstrating how the Assyrian military machine functioned at its peak. The systematic nature of the siege, the integration of multiple weapon systems, the careful preparation, the overwhelming application of force, all of these were characteristic of Assyrian military operations throughout the Near East. Lachish was not an isolated event, but an example of a well-practiced routine that the Assyrians had perfected over generations. Other cities fell using similar methods. The siege ramps, the battering rams, the psychological warfare, the terror tactics. These were standard operating procedure for the Assyrian army. The Assyrian approach to warfare was fundamentally different from what had come before. Earlier armies in the ancient Near East were primarily citizen militias, farmers who campaigned during the season between planting and harvest, then returned to their fields. Warfare was seasonal, limited in scope, and heavily dependent on individual heroics and the favour of the gods. The Assyrians professionalised warfare. They created a permanent standing army that trained year-round and campaigned for extended periods far from home. They developed sophisticated logistics systems, with supply depots positioned along major routes to feed their armies on the march. They pioneered combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, archers, and siege equipment in integrated battle plans. They treated conquest as an administrative problem to be solved through systematic application of violence. Most importantly, the Assyrians understood the psychological dimension of warfare. They recognized that the most efficient conquest was one that required no fighting at all. If cities could be persuaded to surrender without resistance, through reputation and fear, then Assyrian resources would be preserved for campaigns that truly required military force. This is why Assyrian inscriptions and reliefs emphasize brutality in such graphic detail. The descriptions of torture, impalement, flaying, mass execution, these were not just boasts but calculated propaganda designed to terrorize potential opponents into submission. The Assyrian policy was simple: surrender immediately and you will be treated reasonably. Resist and you will be destroyed so utterly that your fate will serve as a warning to others. Many cities chose surrender. Those that resisted, like Lachish, paid a terrible price. The legacy of Assyrian siege warfare extended far beyond the empire itself. When Assyria fell in 612 BCE, conquered by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the techniques and technologies they had developed were adopted by the victors. The Babylonians, who destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE, used methods learned from the Assyrians. The Persians, who built the next great empire, incorporated Assyrian military practices into their own forces. Even Alexander the Great, centuries later, would employ siege techniques that traced their lineage back to Assyrian innovations. The siege ramp, the battering ram, the integration of different military units, these became standard features of ancient warfare, spreading from the Near East to Greece, Rome, and beyond. For the people of Judah, the fall of Lachish marked a turning point in their history. The kingdom never recovered the power and prosperity it had enjoyed before Sennacherib's invasion. Reduced to a tributary state, impoverished by the massive tribute payments, its countryside devastated, Judah limped along for another century before the Babylonians delivered the final blow. The destruction of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon in 586 BCE was, in many ways, a delayed consequence of events set in motion during Sennacherib's campaign. The siege of Lachish foreshadowed the fate that awaited the entire kingdom. The theological interpretation of these events shaped Judaism profoundly. The prophets and priests who tried to make sense of why God had allowed such catastrophe developed a framework that emphasized moral behavior over military strength, faith over fortifications, justice over power. The survival of Jerusalem when Lachish fell was explained as evidence that God protected those who remained faithful, while allowing destruction to fall on those who had strayed from righteousness. This theological response to military disaster would influence how later generations of Jews understood their relationship with God, particularly during subsequent exiles and conquests. The story of Lachish also illustrates the limits of fortification in the face of determined assault. The city had possessed every advantage a defensive position could offer: strong walls, multiple defensive lines, commanding height, adequate supplies, brave defenders. Yet none of it had been sufficient to withstand the Assyrian siege. This was a lesson learned repeatedly throughout ancient history. Given sufficient time, resources, and expertise, attackers could almost always overcome static defences. The Assyrians had simply perfected the techniques that made this possible. Their siege ramps, battering rams, and systematic approach to reducing fortifications made city walls less of an absolute barrier and more of a delaying tactic. Modern visitors to Tel Lachish can walk among the ruins and see evidence of the siege with their own eyes. The massive stone ramp built by the Assyrians is still there, a permanent monument to ancient engineering. The destruction layer, over 2,700 years old, remains visible in excavated sections, a band of black ash and debris marking the moment of catastrophe. Iron arrowheads, identical to those depicted in the Lachish reliefs, are displayed in the site museum. The foundations of the Great Palace Fort can be traced across the summit of the Tell, standing. Atop the ruins on a clear day, one can see the same vista that the defenders saw, the Hebron Hills to the east, the coastal plain to the west, and understand why this location was considered so strategically important. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources makes the Siege of Lachish one of the best documented events from the ancient world. We have the Assyrian royal inscriptions describing Sennacherib's campaign. We have the detailed visual documentation of the Lachish reliefs. We have the biblical accounts in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah. We have the archaeological evidence from decades of excavation. All of these sources tell the same basic story, that in 701 BCE, the Assyrian army besieged and captured the fortress city of Lachish, using overwhelming force and sophisticated siege techniques. The consistency across sources created by victors, victims, and the physical evidence itself gives historians unusual confidence in reconstructing what happened. The fate of Lachish stands as a testament to the effectiveness of the Assyrian war machine. This was an empire that conquered through superior organization, technology, and ruthless application of force. Their army was not just larger than those of their opponents, but better trained, better equipped, and far more professional. Their siege warfare techniques represented the cutting edge of military technology. Their willingness to employ terror tactics on a massive scale made resistance seem futile. For over 2 centuries, this combination made Assyria the dominant power in the Near East, able to defeat any opponent and crush any rebellion. Yet the Assyrian Empire's very success contained the seeds of its downfall. The policy of mass deportation and terror created bitter resentment among subject peoples. The constant need for campaigns to suppress revolts and extract tribute strained even Assyria's considerable resources. The empire became overextended, unable to defend all its borders simultaneously. When enemies finally combined against them, the Babylonians from the south and the Medes from the east, Assyrian power collapsed with shocking suddenness. Within a few years, the empire that had terrorized the Near East for centuries was gone. Nineveh, the great capital, was destroyed so thoroughly that within a few generations its very location was forgotten. The magnificent palaces with their detailed reliefs were buried under centuries of accumulated debris, waiting for 19th century archaeologists to rediscover them. The irony is that the Assyrians' most lasting legacy comes not from their military victories, but from the monuments they created to commemorate those victories. The reliefs they carved to intimidate their contemporaries became invaluable historical documents for future generations. The techniques they developed were adopted by their successors. Even their reputation for brutality served a purpose, making them the archetypal example of an aggressive imperial power for subsequent historians and moralists. The Siege of Lachish, intended as a demonstration of Assyrian supremacy, became instead a case study in the capabilities and limitations of ancient warfare. For modern students of military history, the Siege of Lachish provides unique insights into Iron Age warfare. We can see how ancient armies conducted siege operations, how defenders responded, how engineering played a crucial role in overcoming fortifications. The attention to logistics, the systematic approach to reducing obstacles, the integration of different combat arms, all of these are recognizable as elements of military planning that remain relevant today. The Assyrians may have used spears instead of rifles and battering rams instead of artillery, but the fundamental principles of concentrated force, combined arms, and thorough preparation are timeless. The archaeological work at Lachish continues, with new discoveries adding detail to our understanding of the site. Recent excavations have uncovered earlier occupation layers, showing that the city Sennacherib destroyed was built on the ruins of previous settlements stretching back thousands of years. Evidence of the late Bronze Age Canaanite city has been found, including a temple with ritual objects and inscriptions in early alphabetic script. The successive layers of occupation, destruction, and rebuilding visible in the stratigraphy of Tel Lachish provide a physical record of the region's tumultuous history. The Siege of Lachish represents a moment when the mechanisms of ancient warfare are laid bare for modern examination. The reliefs show us what happened. The inscriptions tell us why it happened. The archaeology confirms where and how it happened. The biblical texts provide the perspective of the victims. Together, these sources create an unusually complete picture of an ancient military operation. We can reconstruct not just the broad outline of events, but specific details of tactics, equipment, and techniques. We can understand the decisions made by both attackers and defenders. We can appreciate the courage of those who fought and the horror of those who suffered. In the end, the story of Lachish is a story about power and its limits. The Assyrian army represented the pinnacle of military capability in its era, able to overcome any defense and crush any resistance. Yet even this formidable machine required weeks of effort and suffered significant casualties to capture a single city. The defenders of Lachish, outmatched in numbers, equipment, and expertise, still managed to inflict heavy losses on their attackers before succumbing to superior force. Both sides demonstrated the capabilities and the costs of ancient warfare. The Assyrians proved that given sufficient resources and expertise, any fortification could be reduced. The defenders of Lachish proved that even against overwhelming odds, determined resistance was possible. Neither side could claim an easy victory. The siege ramp that still stands at Tel Lachish testifies to the effort required. The mass graves testify to the price paid. The day the Assyrian war machine arrived at Lachish marked the beginning of the end for the Kingdom of Judah's independence. The weeks that followed demonstrated the full horror of ancient siege warfare. From the systematic bombardment to the grinding labour of ramp construction to the final assault and sack. The destruction of Lachish was so complete that the city never fully recovered. The trauma was so profound that it was recorded in multiple independent sources and remembered for generations. The techniques employed were so effective that they became the model for siege operations throughout the ancient world. The evidence preserved was so detailed that modern scholars can reconstruct events from over 2,700 years ago with remarkable precision. The siege of Lachish was not just a battle but a turning point, a demonstration of power, a warning to others, and ultimately a monument to the terrible effectiveness of the Assyrian military machine at the height of its power. When the dust settled and the fires burned out, one thing was clear to every city in the ancient Near East. The Assyrians had spoken, and the message was written in blood, ash, and stone. Understanding the broader context of Assyrian military dominance requires examining how their army functioned as a complete system. The soldiers who surrounded Lachish were not hastily assembled militia but professional warriors who had trained together for years. Assyrian military organization represented a revolutionary concept in the ancient world, the creation of permanent military units that existed independently of seasonal campaigns. While neighbouring kingdoms still relied on farmers who put down their ploughs to pick up spears for a few months each year, Assyria maintained a standing force that drilled constantly, perfected their techniques, and developed unit cohesion that multiplied their effectiveness. The recruitment and training system that produced these soldiers was itself an innovation. Young men entered military service as conscripts, but could make careers as professional soldiers if they showed aptitude. The best warriors were selected for elite units, the king's bodyguard and specialist formations that received extra pay and privileges. These professionals formed the core of the army, providing leadership and expertise that raised the performance of the entire force. Foreign auxiliaries and mercenaries supplemented the native Assyrian troops, bringing specialized skills from their home regions. Cavalry from the steppes, slingers from Syria, archers from various provinces, all were integrated into a coherent fighting force under Assyrian command. The logistics that supported this army were equally impressive. Ancient armies typically lived off the land, foraging from the countryside they passed through. This limited campaign duration and restricted strategic mobility. The Assyrians developed a different approach. They established supply depots along major routes, stocking them with grain, weapons, and equipment. These depots allowed armies to campaign far from Assyrian territory for extended periods. Quartermasters calculated consumption rates and ensured that supplies reached forward units. Transport columns, organized with military precision, kept the army fed and equipped. This logistical infrastructure transformed warfare from seasonal raiding into sustained military operations that could achieve strategic objectives regardless of harvest schedules. The road network that connected these depots was itself a military asset. Assyrian engineers built and maintained roads suitable for moving large formations rapidly across varied terrain. These weren't simple dirt tracks but engineered routes, graded, drained, and reinforced where necessary. Bridges spanned rivers that would otherwise have required time-consuming fording operations. The same roads that moved armies in wartime carried trade in peace, binding the empire together economically as well as militarily. The Roman road system, often celebrated as an engineering marvel, had its precedent in these Assyrian routes built centuries earlier. Communication systems allowed Assyrian commanders to coordinate operations across vast distances. Relay stations positioned along major routes enabled messages to travel much faster than marching armies. Mounted couriers carried dispatches between units, allowing the king to direct multiple simultaneous campaigns from his capital. Intelligence gathering was systematized, with scouts and spies providing information about enemy dispositions, fortifications, and intentions. This information flowed to headquarters where staff officers analyzed it and planned campaigns accordingly. The Assyrian military operated with a level of coordination and central control that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the modern era. The weapons and equipment that Assyrian soldiers carried reflected decades of refinement and improvement. The iron spear that formed the basic armament of heavy infantry had been perfected through countless iterations. The shaft was carefully selected hardwood, straight-grained and properly seasoned to resist warping and splitting. The iron head was forged to an optimal balance between penetrating power and durability, heat-treated to maintain an edge through repeated use. The butt spike served dual purposes, allowing the spear to be planted firmly in the ground and providing a backup weapon if the head broke. Every component was designed based on battlefield experience. Armour evolved in response to changing threats. Early Assyrian soldiers wore relatively simple protection, leather reinforced with bronze scales. As iron became more common, armour improved dramatically. Iron scales were lighter and stronger than bronze, allowing for better coverage without sacrificing mobility. Helmets developed from simple caps to sophisticated designs that protected the skull, face, and neck while maintaining visibility and hearing. Shields grew larger and more specialized, with different designs for different roles. Heavy infantry carried massive rectangular shields that could interlock to form a shield wall. Archers had lighter shields or relied on dedicated shield bearers who protected them while they shot. Cavalry used smaller round shields that didn't interfere with riding. The composite bow used by Assyrian archers was a technological marvel in itself. Constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, carefully shaped and glued, then reinforced with bark and leather wrapping, these bows combined tremendous power with reasonable size. A well-made composite bow could punch an arrow through armour at ranges where simple wooden bows were ineffective. The construction process took months and required specialised craftsmen who understood the properties of different materials and how they worked together. The finished product was an asymmetric recurve design that maximised energy storage and transfer, achieving draw weights that few men could handle without years of training. Arrows were equally sophisticated. The shaft had to be perfectly straight, properly spined to match the bow's power, fletched with feathers arranged to impart stabilising spin. The heads came in various designs for different purposes: broad heads with wide cutting edges for use against unarmoured targets, narrow bodkin points designed to penetrate armour, incendiary arrows wrapped with material that could be set alight to start fires in enemy positions. Each archer carried dozens of arrows in a quiver designed for quick access, allowing sustained fire that could overwhelm defenders. The psychological warfare that the Assyrians employed was as carefully planned as their military tactics. The reputation for brutality that they cultivated was not accidental, but a deliberate strategy to reduce resistance. Assyrian kings commissioned detailed inscriptions describing their conquests in graphic terms. These weren't private records, but public monuments, displayed where foreigners would see them. The message was clear and intentional: resist and face horrors beyond imagination, submit and be treated mercifully. Many cities chose submission, calculating correctly that survival as an Assyrian vassal was preferable to destruction. The deportation policy that the Assyrians implemented after conquering resistant populations served multiple purposes. Most obviously, it removed potential troublemakers from their home regions where they might organize future rebellions. But it also provided labor for Assyrian construction projects and agricultural expansion. Skilled craftsmen were particularly valuable, their expertise enriching Assyrian cities with the best techniques from across the empire. The mixed populations that resulted from these deportations made nationalism impossible. How could people rebel when their neighbours spoke different languages and worshipped different gods? The policy was cruel but effective, allowing Assyria to rule vast territories with relatively small occupation forces. The religious dimension of Assyrian warfare cannot be ignored. Like all ancient peoples, the Assyrians believed their gods demanded conquest and rewarded victory. The king was the chief priest as well as military commander, conducting rituals before campaigns to secure divine favour. Captured gods, in the form of their cult statues, were carried back to Assyria as trophies, demonstrating the superiority of Assyrian deities over foreign pantheons. This religious ideology provided moral justification for what might otherwise seem like simple aggression. The Assyrians weren't just conquering for wealth and power, but fulfilling divine will, bringing order to a chaotic world through the imposition of Assyrian rule. The engineering corps that built the siege ramp at Lachish was one of the most important elements of the Assyrian army. These specialists understood principles of mathematics and physics that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries. They could survey terrain, calculate volumes, estimate labour requirements, and design structures that would support enormous weights. The siege ramp was not just a pile of stones, but an engineered structure, carefully graded to maintain stability, properly drained to prevent erosion, reinforced at stress points to prevent collapse under the weight of siege towers. Building it required not just muscle, but knowledge, the accumulated expertise of generations of military engineers. These same engineers built the pontoon bridges that allowed Assyrian armies to cross rivers that would have stopped other forces. They constructed temporary fortifications around besieged cities, protecting the besiegers from relief attacks. They designed and operated the siege towers, battering rams and other equipment that made fortifications vulnerable. In a real sense, Assyrian military dominance rested as much on engineering expertise as on warrior courage. The ability to reduce fortified cities meant that enemies couldn't simply retreat behind walls and wait out the attackers. Eventually, Assyrian engineers would find a way through. The chariots that accompanied the Assyrian army to Lachish represented an older military technology that was slowly being superseded by cavalry, but remained impressive nonetheless. Assyrian chariots were larger and heavier than earlier designs, carrying crews of 3 or 4 men rather than the traditional 2. One man drove while others fought, armed with bows and spears. The chariot provided a mobile platform for archery, allowing skilled warriors to shoot while moving at speeds infantry couldn't match. The psychological impact of charging chariots, the thunder of hooves and wheels, the cloud of dust, the bristling weapons, could break enemy formations before contact. But chariots had limitations that cavalry didn't share. They required relatively flat terrain to operate effectively. Rough ground, forests, and steep slopes rendered them useless. They were expensive to build and maintain, requiring skilled craftsmen to construct the complex wheels and fittings. Each chariot needed multiple horses, straining logistics. Most importantly, a mounted archer could do everything a chariot crew could do with a fraction of the resources. By Sennacherib's time, cavalry was increasingly replacing chariots as the mobile arm of the Assyrian military. The transition would be completed by the Persian Empire that inherited Assyrian military traditions. The cavalry that the Assyrians pioneered represented the future of ancient warfare. Early mounted warriors rode in pairs, one handling the reins while the other shot. This awkward arrangement limited effectiveness. Later developments, including improved saddles and training techniques, allowed individual riders to control their horses while fighting. Cavalry could operate in terrain where chariots couldn't venture. They could scout ahead of the main force, harry retreating enemies, pursue broken formations, and provide rapid response to unexpected threats. The Assyrians recognized these advantages and invested heavily in developing cavalry capabilities, breeding suitable horses and training riders to professional standards. The horses themselves were crucial to cavalry effectiveness. The small horses of earlier periods couldn't carry armoured riders for extended periods. The Assyrians imported larger, stronger breeds from the Zagros Mountains and Central Asian steppes. These animals could carry fully equipped warriors at speed over long distances. Horse breeding became a royal monopoly, with the best animals reserved for military use. Captured horses from conquered territories supplemented the supply, ensuring that Assyrian cavalry units remained well mounted despite the inevitable attrition of campaign. The infantry that formed the bulk of Assyrian armies came in several varieties, each optimized for specific roles. Heavy infantry, armored and equipped with spear and shield, held the battle line and provided stability in combat. These men trained constantly in formation fighting, learning to move and fight as a unit rather than as individuals. The Assyrian phalanx wasn't as developed as the later Greek version, but the basic concept of massed spearmen supporting each other was well understood. Light infantry provided flexibility, skirmishing ahead of the main force, guarding flanks, and pursuing defeated enemies. Slingers, armed with simple but effective weapons, could harass enemies from longer ranges than javelin throwers. The combination of these different troop types, heavy infantry, light infantry, archers, slingers, cavalry, and chariots, gave Assyrian commanders tremendous tactical flexibility. They could adapt their approach to enemy strengths and weaknesses, terrain conditions, and strategic objectives. Against heavily armoured opponents, archers would be used extensively to wear them down before infantry engaged. Against more mobile enemies, cavalry would pursue while infantry held strong defensive positions. The ability to employ combined arms tactics gave Assyria an enormous advantage over opponents who relied on a single troop type or tactical approach. Command and control in the Assyrian army functioned through a clear hierarchy. The king commanded personally when present, making strategic decisions and inspiring the troops with his presence. Below him, generals commanded field armies, provincial governors led local forces, and unit commanders directed specific formations. Standard bearers carried the symbols of different units, allowing soldiers to identify their formations in the chaos of battle. Musicians signalled orders, different drum patterns and horn calls communicating commands across distances where voices couldn't carry. This system allowed large formations to manoeuvre with coordination that seemed impossible to enemies who lacked similar organisation. The camp that the Assyrian army established outside Lachish was itself a fortified position, protected by ditches and palisades. Inside, tents were arranged in orderly rows, with specific areas designated for different units and functions. Command tents occupied the centre where they were most protected. Supply depots held food, weapons and equipment. Corrals kept horses and pack animals contained. Latrines were dug at the camp perimeter, maintaining sanitation that reduced disease. Guard posts surrounded the perimeter, manned around the clock to prevent surprise attacks. The camp was a temporary city, organised with military precision and capable of housing tens of thousands of men. Living conditions in the camp were harsh by modern standards, but better than what most armies of the period endured. Soldiers received regular rations of bread, beer and meat, supplemented by whatever could be purchased or foraged locally. Water was carefully managed, with designated sources and guards to prevent contamination. Medical care was basic, but better than nothing, with personnel who could treat wounds, set bones, and provide basic first aid. Entertainment in the evenings included dice games, wrestling matches, and storytelling. Discipline was strict, with severe punishments for infractions that threatened unit cohesion or mission success. The religious observances that accompanied military campaigns were constant. Priests travelled with the army, conducting daily rituals and interpreting omens. Before major operations, sacrifices were offered to ensure divine favour. After victories, thanksgiving ceremonies acknowledged the gods' role in success. Soldiers carried amulets and wore symbols of protective deities. This pervasive religiosity reinforced unit cohesion and provided psychological comfort in the face of danger. Modern scholars might dismiss these practices as superstition, but for ancient warriors, divine support was as important as sharp weapons and strong walls. The economic impact of Assyrian military operations was enormous. Campaigns were expensive, requiring massive investments in equipment, supplies, and wages. But successful conquest more than paid for itself through plunder, tribute, and the long-term benefits of controlling trade routes and agricultural regions. The wealth that flowed into Assyria from conquered territories funded magnificent construction projects in the capital. The palaces that Sennacherib built were decorated with the spoils of conquest, precious metals, exotic woods, and skilled artisans captured in campaigns. The economy of the empire was fundamentally militarized, with conquest providing the resources that sustained further conquest. The social structure of Assyria reflected this military focus. Warriors enjoyed high status and substantial privileges. Successful generals could rise to powerful positions, governing provinces and commanding resources. Even common soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle received rewards and recognition. This created a society where military service was attractive, drawing ambitious men who saw warfare as a path to advancement. The Assyrian nobility was fundamentally a warrior aristocracy, defining itself through military achievement and measuring status by success in battle. The administration of conquered territories required a bureaucracy to match the military machine that captured them. Provincial governors were appointed to rule conquered regions, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and suppressing rebellion. These officials were supported by scribes who kept detailed records of tribute payments, troop dispositions, and local conditions. The paperwork that resulted, preserved on clay tablets that have survived millennia, provides modern historians with invaluable insights into how the empire functioned. We can read correspondence between provincial governors and the king, reports on military operations, and economic records that detail tribute collections. The cultural exchange that resulted from Assyrian conquest was substantial despite the violent methods. Conquered peoples brought their ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions into the empire. Assyrian craftsmen learned techniques from across the Near East, incorporating them into their own work. The famous Assyrian lion hunt reliefs show artistic sophistication that drew on Egyptian, Babylonian, and other traditions. The cuneiform writing system that the Assyrians used was adapted from Babylonian originals. Even Assyrian religion incorporated deities and myths from conquered peoples, demonstrating cultural influence flowing in both directions despite political domination. The libraries that Assyrian kings established, most famously the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, preserved knowledge from across the ancient world. Clay tablets containing literature, scientific treatises, mathematical works, and historical records were collected and copied. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, these tablets were buried in the ruins where they remained until modern archaeologists excavated them. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, is known primarily from copies preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. The irony is profound. The empire that conquered through violence preserved cultural achievements that outlasted the military power that collected them. The decline of Assyria, when it came, was swift and catastrophic. The same factors that had enabled their dominance, professional military, advanced technology, sophisticated organization, were eventually matched by their enemies. The Babylonians and Medes who combined against Assyria in the late 7th century BCE had learned Assyrian methods and could employ them with equal effectiveness. The empire's resources were overstretched by centuries of constant warfare. The subject peoples who had been held in submission by terror and force saw an opportunity for revenge. When the coalition armies besieged Nineveh in 612 BCE, the capital that had seemed impregnable fell in a matter of months. The destruction of Nineveh was as complete as the destruction the Assyrians had inflicted on their enemies. The palaces were burned, the walls torn down, the population scattered or killed. Within a generation, the site was abandoned, gradually buried under accumulated earth. The mighty empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries disappeared so thoroughly that later generations questioned whether it had really existed. Only the biblical accounts preserved memory of Assyrian power, and even those seemed like exaggerations until 19th century archaeologists began uncovering the physical evidence. The rediscovery of Assyria in the modern era began with these archaeological excavations. Layard's finds at Nineveh sparked intense interest in ancient Mesopotamia. Other sites were explored, including the Assyrian military capital at Nimrud, where more reliefs and inscriptions were found. The development of the ability to read cuneiform script allowed scholars to translate the royal inscriptions and administrative tablets that had been preserved. Gradually, the history of Assyria was reconstructed from these sources, revealing an empire whose military sophistication and administrative complexity rivaled anything in the ancient world. The Lachish reliefs held special importance in this reconstruction because they provided visual documentation that could be compared with physical evidence at the siege site. The correspondence between artistic depiction and archaeological reality demonstrated that the reliefs were based on actual observation, not artistic imagination. This gave historians confidence that other Assyrian reliefs similarly depicted real events and equipment rather than idealized or exaggerated versions. The result was a window into ancient warfare that no purely textual source could provide. Modern military historians studying the siege of Lachish find it remarkably informative about ancient operational art. The Assyrian approach was methodical and thorough. Intelligence gathering provided information about the target. Logistical preparation ensured adequate supplies for an extended siege. The investment of the city was complete, preventing relief or escape. The siege ramp was built with the engineering expertise that maximized attacker advantages while minimizing defender strengths. The final assault employed combined arms tactics with infantry, archers and siege equipment all playing coordinated roles. Every phase demonstrated sophisticated military planning executed by professional forces. The defenders of Lachish, by contrast, were working with limited resources and inferior numbers, yet they fought with determination and inflicted casualties on the attackers that suggest competent leadership and brave soldiers. The counter-ramp they built showed understanding of siege warfare principles. The volume of missiles they launched at attackers indicates good logistics and weapon stockpiles. The fact that the siege required weeks rather than days demonstrates that Lachish's fortifications and garrison were formidable obstacles even to Assyrian expertise. In the end, numbers and professionalism prevailed, but the defenders earned respect even from their enemies. The lessons that military forces learned from Assyrian methods influenced warfare for centuries. The Romans, who built the next great Western Empire, employed siege techniques that traced directly to Assyrian innovations. The integration of engineering with military operations became standard practice. The concept of professional soldiers trained to organizational standards rather than individual heroics became foundational to effective armies. Even the psychological dimension of warfare, the deliberate cultivation of reputation to reduce resistance, was something later empires consciously employed. In the specific context of the ancient Near East, the siege of Lachish marked a turning point in the balance of power. Judah's defeat in 701 BCE demonstrated that even relatively strong kingdoms couldn't resist Assyrian might. Other small states took note and adjusted their policies accordingly. Rebellion against Assyria became less common after Sennacherib's campaign, not because subject peoples loved their overlords, but because resistance had been proven futile. The empire enjoyed a period of relative stability in its western provinces, allowing resources to be directed elsewhere. For Jerusalem, the survival after Lachish fell created a sense of providential protection that shaped Jewish theology profoundly. The city became invested with religious significance beyond its practical importance as a capital. The temple became the focus of religious life in a way it hadn't been before. The prophetic tradition that emphasized moral behavior over military strength gained adherents. These developments would have enormous consequences for the development of Judaism, and, through it, for Christianity and Islam that emerged from the same religious tradition. The physical remains of the siege of Lachish continue to yield information as archaeological techniques improve. Modern methods allow researchers to analyze destruction layers with unprecedented precision, determining burn temperatures, identifying weapon types from metal fragments, even reconstructing individual events during the siege. DNA analysis of human remains from the mass graves provides information about the ethnic composition of defenders and attackers. Isotope analysis of bones reveals where individuals grew up and what they ate. Every new technique adds detail to our understanding of what happened at Lachish over 2,700 years ago. The broader pattern of Assyrian military operations, of which Lachish was one example, represented a fundamental transformation in how states approached warfare. Before Assyria, military operations were primarily tactical, focused on winning individual battles. The Assyrians thought strategically, planning campaigns to achieve political objectives through the systematic application of military force. They understood that conquest required not just battlefield victory, but the subsequent administration of captured territory. They recognized that terror could be a force multiplier, reducing resistance through reputation. These insights seem obvious to modern military planners but represented genuine innovations in the ancient world. The siege warfare techniques that the Assyrians perfected would remain the dominant approach to reducing fortifications until the development of gunpowder artillery. The basic principles they established — isolate the target, cut supply lines, build approach works to overcome defensive advantages, breach fortifications through concentrated force, and overwhelm defenders through coordinated assault — remained valid for thousands of years. Medieval siege warfare differed in details, but followed the same fundamental logic that Assyrian engineers had worked out. Even modern combined arms operations using different tools employ similar concepts of overwhelming defenders through coordinated application of multiple capabilities. The story of Lachish reminds us that historical events are experienced differently by winners and losers. For the Assyrians, the siege was a successful military operation, worthy of commemoration but not particularly unusual. Sennacherib's inscriptions list dozens of cities captured during the campaign, treating Lachish as one entry in a long list. For the people of Judah, however, the fall of Lachish was a catastrophe, the destruction of their second city, and the effective end of their independence. The biblical authors devoted significant attention to the event, understanding it as a pivotal moment in their history. Both perspectives are valid, reflecting the different stakes involved for conquerors and conquered. The archaeological preservation of the siege site is itself remarkable. That the siege ramp still exists, that artifacts from the battle can still be found, that the destruction layer is still visible, all of this represents unusual good fortune for historians. Most ancient battlefields leave little trace. Wood decays, metal corrodes, earthworks erode, bodies decompose without leaving skeletal remains. The specific conditions at Lachish, the dry climate, the rapid burial under destruction debris, the abandonment that prevented later construction from destroying evidence, combined to preserve a snapshot of ancient warfare that few other sites can match. The human dimension of the siege, the experience of individuals caught in these events, can only be imagined based on the physical evidence and general knowledge of ancient warfare. The soldiers of both sides were real people with hopes, fears, families, and dreams. The civilians trapped inside Lachish, as the siege tightened, experienced terror that transcended time and culture. The defenders who manned the walls, knowing they faced overwhelming odds, demonstrated courage that demands respect. Even the Assyrian soldiers, following orders and doing their professional duty, were caught in circumstances beyond their control. The siege was not just a military operation, but a human tragedy played out across weeks of violence and suffering. The final assault, when it came, must have been chaos. The sustained bombardment from siege towers, the crash of battering rams against stone and brick, the smoke from fires started by incendiary arrows, the screams of wounded and dying men, the desperate last stand of defenders who knew defeat meant death or slavery. All of this compressed into a few hours of concentrated violence that ended with Assyrian soldiers pouring through breached walls into the city. The killing that followed, the destruction, the plunder, these were the inevitable conclusion to a siege that the defenders had lost before it began. The aftermath, with survivors being led into captivity and the city burning behind them, marked the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. Lachish would eventually be rebuilt, but never again as the powerful fortress it had been. Judah would continue as a kingdom, but as a tributary client state rather than an independent power. The regional balance of power had shifted decisively, with consequences that would echo through the following century until the final Babylonian conquest. All of this flowed from those weeks in 701 BCE when the Assyrian war machine demonstrated its terrible effectiveness on the hills of the Shephelah. Today, visitors walking through the ruins of Tel Lachish can still sense the weight of these events. The massive siege ramp, overgrown with vegetation, but still clearly visible, stands as a monument to Assyrian determination. The thick destruction layer visible in excavated sections testifies to the completeness of the catastrophe. The artifacts displayed in the site museum, arrowheads, sling stones, storage jar fragments with royal seals, connect modern observers to ancient realities. The ruins speak across millennia, telling a story of ambition and resistance, power and vulnerability, victory and tragedy. The siege of Lachish was one battle in one campaign of one empire, but its documentation, both ancient and modern, makes it one of the most thoroughly understood military operations from the ancient world. In stone reliefs, clay inscriptions, biblical texts, and archaeological evidence, we can reconstruct not just what happened, but how and why, achieving an understanding of ancient warfare that earlier generations of historians could only dream of achieving. The day the Assyrian war machine arrived at the walls of Lachish, it brought with it the full weight of ancient military sophistication, and when it departed, it left behind ruins that would teach future generations about the nature of power, the cost of resistance, and the terrible efficiency of ancient conquest at its most developed form.